Hey everybody, in today's video we are going to be referencing some of the claims that Donald Trump made about the 2020 election. Specifically that there was massive fraud on the part of the Democrats to steal the election from him and that he actually won it. I want to say explicitly and clearly at the top of this video that those claims are patently false. They're completely bogus. Joe Biden won the election by a sizable amount. He won both the electors and the popular vote. There was no fraud. There was no big fraud that changed the outcome of the election. There was no conspiracy by the Democrats. These are completely false. The purpose of this video is not to debunk those claims. That has already been done many times in many other places better than I could possibly do it. The purpose of this video is to use those claims as an object lesson for how to examine claims like these. Some of the questions you might ask, some of the steps you might take. That is why we're doing this. So please don't post down in the comments, what about this, what about that? I'm not going to respond to any of those. And if you're obnoxious, I will block you. Again, that is not the purpose of this video. So let's get on with it, shall we? I had the occasion to be talking with a friend of mine the other day about Trump's second impeachment, and he had raised some concerns about Trump being impeached while out of office. And in responding to that, I mentioned that Trump was actually impeached while he was still in office, that it was the hearing that was happening after he was out of office, that Mitch McConnell could have held the hearing while he was still in office. He had that power. He refused to do that. And also there is precedent for people being impeached after they're out of office, not president, but other public officials. This has already happened in our history. He was, I think it is fair to say, impressed with the information that I had on hand. And he was asking me about sources that I have, that I use, websites that I go to, podcasts that I listen to, that kind of thing. And honestly, it was hard to know where to begin. There's a lot to cover. And I wanted to talk with him about what kinds of processes I use when I examine claims, especially really extraordinary claims like this. And I started writing notes down, and I thought, you know what? This would make a good video. So here we are. Now, where to begin? I'd like to begin by talking about something called the null hypothesis, and that is a starting place that we use whenever we encounter something like this. Now, this is a philosophical concept that's used in scientific investigation and largely in medical investigations when you're doing like drug studies and stuff like that. The way it works in those settings is something like this. You have a person who's sick, you devise a treatment, you administer the treatment, and they get better. The null hypothesis says you start by assuming that the treatment did not actually cure the illness until you have established enough evidence to say for certain that it has. The way we expand this into a larger scope, into a more general scope, is whenever we are presented with a claim, we start by not assuming that the claim is true. We start by not accepting the truth proposition of the claim. This doesn't mean that we assume that it's false. It's important to remember that X is true and X is false are two separate propositions, and each one can be accepted or not accepted independently. So we start by not accepting the proposition that X is true. So the proposition comes out that Trump actually won the election, that the Democrats committed fraud. We start by not accepting that it is true. We reserve judgment until we have enough evidence to make a determination about the truth or falsehood of that particular claim. And then we start moving on from there. So one of the first things we want to look at is the origin of the claim, the source of the claim. Now, you want to be very careful here to not run across the genetic fallacy. And the genetic fallacy means that you assume a claim is false because of the source of that claim. And that is a fallacious approach. There are definitely times where the source of a claim will raise concerns or suspicions and will insist that the claim gets deeper and further scrutiny. And The classic example of this is tobacco companies releasing reports saying that smoking is perfectly safe. Those reports may be true. I mean, the ones that were released aren't, they were bogus, but they may be true. You can't assume that they're false just because it's the tobacco industry that released them. However, the fact that it is the tobacco industry that released them, that they have a vested interest in promoting the idea that cigarette smoking is safe, means that those claims are suspect, those reports are suspect, and that they deserve deeper scrutiny. Another thing you want to keep in mind is looking for primary sources. There was a story that was going around a little while ago about a wildlife organization that could use leftover mascara brushes for, I think, cleaning oils off of like wildlife that had been damaged by oil spills, that kind of thing. I think, I don't remember the exact details. That was roughly what it was. And I saw people posting this, and someone had posted about it, and they said, mentioned it, and then someone asked them, did you fact check this? And the person said, no, but it came from a friend of mine who's an Audubon Society member, and I trust them. Turns out this particular story was true, but the problem there was he wasn't coming from a primary source. The primary source was the organization that was actually asking for these little old mascara brushes. It was not some friend of his, even if he trusts his friend, and I have a lot of friends that I trust, even if this friend shared the information in good faith, which they probably did, they can still be in error. They could still accidentally be sharing a bogus story. So going to primary sources is very important. And when we look to the primary source for the claims that there was fraud by the Democrats, that Trump really won the election, the primary source is Trump himself, which automatically raises our suspicion level, demands deeper, closer scrutiny of these, because Trump obviously has a vested interest in promoting this narrative that he actually won. He was looking to overturn the election. So the claims came from Trump himself, and more than that, even though he has access to people that can do investigations on things like this, he himself was not in a position to be immediately aware, directly aware of any fraudulent activity. He's not an investigator. He's not a poll watcher. He doesn't run any elections for his state or nationally or anything like that. So he is already removed from a primary source of information about whether or not these actually happened. So looking at the source is important. Again, don't commit the genetic fallacy. Don't automatically assume it's false because somebody says it, because you don't trust the source, because you think the source is a liar, because they have a motive, invested interest in keeping it going. So don't do that. But definitely look at who the source is. Make sure your primary source is, and look at who the source is to determine whether or not they're reliable in that case, or whether or not we should be extra careful about how we handle this information. Another thing you can look at is the historical context surrounding the claim. In this case, there's two areas I think of where this applies in this case. First of all is, how have elections been in the U.S. historically over time? If you look back, it's clear and obvious that U.S. presidential elections, certainly in recent history, have been fair and free of any large-scale fraud. There's always tiny, tiny elements of fraud in a presidential election, but they never amount to anything. And we're talking a handful of cases across millions and millions of voters. It's individuals doing things and not enough to be like a massive conspiracy and actually change the outcome of the election. No fraud has ever affected the outcome of a presidential election, not even close. So that's one element that we look at that rules in favor of thinking that these are false, is that historically the U.S. has not had flawed elections. Now, looking at the historic information, one of the criticisms that was raised by Trump was the question of the mail-in votes. Even though we're looking historically back at how the U.S. elections have been in the past, there was a different factor in this one. In this case, it was the mail-in votes. And it's fair to ask us, does this change how safe and secure the voting system is? And that's a very fair question. We have an easy answer to that question when we look. Several states had done mass mail-in voting, including during the 2016 presidential election. And those mail-in ballots and mail-in voting systems worked just fine. They were safe. they were secure, and they were reliable, and they were free from major fraud. So again, it's fair to raise those questions when looking back historically to see that there is something different now than what has been going on in the past. But when we look at it closely, we can see that it's not a relevant point. Another part of sort of historically that we can look at is the behaviors of the person historically who's making the claim. And in this case, we can clearly see, even starting with the 2016 election, fraud planting seeds of this conspiracy theory, saying that he would never commit to definitely accepting the results of an election. Over the course of 2020, he planted all kinds of doubts about the safety and security of the election that were completely unfounded, without substance, without merit. So he started building this narrative the year prior to the election actually happening. So when he makes the claim that all of these things that he said were going to happen actually happened, you can see historically that he was building this narrative. He spent a long time priming the country for this conspiracy theory, and then he closed out on it. So looking at both the history of how the election system has been in the U.S. historically and the history of the actions of the person who's making the claim are both relevant to analyzing the situation and the claims at hand. Another thing we can look at, especially in the case of conspiracy theories, what is the scope of the conspiracy? Are we talking about half a dozen people, a dozen people, 100 people, 1,000 people? What kind of logistics are involved? How difficult would it be for this fraud, this conspiracy theory, to actually have been executed? And if we look in the case of the presidential election, the 2020 presidential election, we see it would be mind-bogglingly massive. You would have to have coordinated efforts across multiple states nationwide to actually generate millions of bogus ballots favoring Biden instead of Trump, elimination of some of Trump's ballots, switching them over. The level of conspiracy is just absurd when you start to think about it. The number of people that would have to be involved is just crazy big. And we're not just talking about Democrats either. We're talking about voting systems in place in states that include many Republicans. And this is very clear in the example of Georgia, which came up so often afterwards. We have the Secretary of State, Ratzenberger, who was a lifelong Republican, was a Trump supporter and donated to Trump's campaign. We've got a governor and a lieutenant governor who are both lifelong Republicans. The governor was Trump actually campaigned for him to get him elected. So these are clearly people that would favor Trump winning, that would be predisposed to Trump this actually being true, that Trump would actually win. And in this case, it's very clear, it's very explicit that there was no widespread fraud in the state. So you not only have big systems that need to be worked to make this happen, but they are systems not under the Democrats' control. And another principle to look at when examining the scope of the conspiracy is the idea of Occam's razor. Now, Occam's razor is often stated as the simplest explanation is usually the best. That's not really the best way to phrase it. The best way to phrase it is saying that the explanation that requires the least amount of additional assumptions is the favored one. In this case, do we have other hypotheses or other ideas that explain the facts at hand without adding on the notion of a conspiracy? And one of the elements of this that Trump talks about was the spike in votes that he claims that happened overnight while ballots were being counted after Election Day. Like between Election Day and the next day, there was a sudden spike in Democratic votes for Joe Biden. Now, there are facts that explain this. We know that there was a lot of mail-in voting. We know that the mail-in voting favored the Democrats. And we know that in these states, they were not allowed to count the mail-in votes until after Election Day. So with those known facts prior to the election, we would expect to see a sudden spike in votes for the Democrat as those mail-in ballots were counted towards the end of the day and overnight. We have facts that explain the event without any question. Now, you would have to add on to that another assumption that there was this fraud taking place, that all these crazy ballots were being created or switched over or whatever was going on. And you don't need to add that. This violates the principle of Occam's razor. We already have facts that explain the event. We don't need to add anything to that. Another question we can ask ourselves when looking at something like this is, what else would we expect to be true if this fraud was actually true? And a really big standout on this one is if the statement, the Democrats committed fraud to steal the presidential election away from Donald Trump, why would they not also gain control of Congress in the process? If they're faking all of these ballots, if they're flipping ballots over, if they have that kind of access and that kind of ability to change the results of the presidential election, which is on the same physical ballot that the congressional elections are on, why would they not also give themselves control of Congress? There were plenty of close congressional races that they could have won without looking suspicious. Again, Georgia is a perfect example of this. There was a very close race. It actually went to a runoff election. It would have only taken a few thousand votes to firmly put that in the Democrat camp instead of the Republican camp. If they created, according to Trump, 12,000 ballots to change to cost him the election in Georgia, why would they not also swing the congressional election in their favor as well? This is one of these questions you can ask, like, what else would be true if this were true? And clearly, if they had committed that kind of fraud, they would have taken control of Congress as well and done it solidly instead of by a razor-thin margin, instead of going to a runoff election. It doesn't make any sense that they would engage in this massive, massive campaign, bring all these logistics into place and do all this other stuff to get one election and not get other elections that weren't on exactly the same ballot. It just completely doesn't make any sense. And those are, again, that's the kind of question. If X conspiracy is true, if X claim is true, what else would we expect to be seeing if that were also true? One of the other things I'd like to bring up is looking at experts and professionals and what kind of information you're getting from them. You see this a lot, like in a lot of the science conspiracy theory stuff that's out right now, or even let's just go with like flat earth things, these crazy flat earth conspiracies that are out there. And yes, I'm using the word crazy because the people that are passing them aren't crazy, but the conspiracy theories are crazy. And you look at scientific experts or other professional experts in the field that actually know about the field and study it and are engaged with the science and the hard facts around it, and what do they have to say about it. And clearly the earth is a globe. It's not flat. You can look at geologists. They will tell you that. Astrophysicists, cosmologists, airline pilots, military experts who actually have to compensate for the shape of the earth when doing like long-range military shooting. Bridge builders who have actually had to compensate for the curve of the earth with long, long bridges that have been built. I mean, it's just a fact. So in the case of this conspiracy theory, we can look at the experts and professionals who were tasked with overseeing the safety and security of the election. Chris Krebs obviously comes to mind. It was his specific job to use Homeland Security and all these other investigative agencies to make sure that the election was safe, secure, and free of fraud. And he put out a report saying that that was the case. And Trump fired him. This is a person who was his character. He was known for being politically neutral. He was known for being very good at his work. So he's a fairly reliable source on this. And he drew from other agencies that were all saying the same thing. One of the other things we can look at when we're looking at other sources to examine these kind of claims is the idea of a hostile or friendly witness. It's like in court, you bring in hostile witnesses who are people that would want to see you convicted, and we bring in friendly witnesses who are people that would want to see you, exonerated. So we can look at the kind of people that are talking about the election fraud, and we would expect to see people who are friendly to Donald Trump supporting the claims, like Ted Cruz, and we would see people who are against Donald Trump, like Nancy Pelosi, objecting to the fraud claims. But when we look at people who you would expect to be supporting Donald Trump, and they also refute the claims, that adds weight to their testimony. In this case, Bill Barr is an excellent example of that. He was definitely a very close associate with Trump. Trump's head of the Department of Justice. He came out after the election saying, look, the DOJ has done an investigation. There was no widespread fraud that changed the outcome of the election. Now, coming from Bill Barr, this is added weight, because if there was even the hint of an election fraud, he would be all over that. He would be wanting to support that because he would want to keep Donald Trump in power because it was favorable to him to do that. He was a Trump supporter. Again, you look back at Georgia, the lieutenant governor, the governor, and the secretary of state, Ratzenberger. These are all people who wanted to see Trump stay in power. They all the way down the line, said that there was no major election fraud in Georgia. So because of the fact that they would normally be friendly witnesses for Trump, that the fact that they're saying that there was no election fraud carries a little extra weight there. One of the things I really like to do is look at different sources that are reporting the same story, sources with known biases that are reporting the same story, and see how each different source reports on that story. You can look at like Fox News and MSNBC, clearly two organizations that are extremely polarized, that are extremely biased to the right and to the left, and see how each of them is reporting on these stories. And, you know, if you see Fox reporting that there was no widespread fraud, that adds a little weight. But you can also start to see the biases that they inject into their reporting. For example, one of the complaints against CNN right now is that they are lightly reporting or not reporting against scandalous allegations against Mario Cuomo. Because he's definitely left-leaning. They're very friendly with him. They're very supportive. In fact, I think he's got a relative that works for CNN. And these ideas about these scandals about the nursing home deaths with COVID and the sex allegation scandals are kind of getting glossed over by some of these other outlets because they're reporting in a favorable way towards him. So looking at how these different news outlets do their reporting, what kind of biases are being injected, and I need to do an entire other video on biases in news to talk about how to get to bias sources. But you can also look at those and make comparative analyses between these different news sources. And again, if you see a source friendly to the president, like Fox News, like Tucker Carlson, who said, we're getting no evidence. I've asked for the evidence repeated. It hasn't been handed to me. Like, that is a moment of honesty from a person who's not well known for his journalistic honesty, to be quite frank, saying, look, there's nothing here. And if there was even the hint of something there, Tucker Carlson would be the first person to share it. So that is just kind of an overview of some of the ideas, some of the questions that you can ask, some of the ways you can approach analyzing claims like these, some of the steps you can take. It is not nearly a comprehensive list. And almost all of these subsections deserve a video of their own, and some of them I think will get a video of their own, like media bias and how to suss it out and things like that. Definitely are deserving of their own videos. But I just kind of wanted to give an overview of the process, how things work, how I look at things, and let you take it from there. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to like. If you didn't, thumbs down is fine. I won't judge. Like I said, please don't post in the comments about Trump actually having won the election, because I will at best ignore them. I will not engage with any of that stuff. And if you're obnoxious or hostile, you're just going to be gone. That's all. Have a great day, and as always, be kind to one another.